This session is titled The Rhetorical Performance of Music, and Dr. Elizabeth Grimpo, Professor of Music, has been teaching here at Concordia University, Nebraska since 2008. In addition to teaching, she actively performs as both a solo and collaborative pianist, performing music from the classical repertoire as well as newly composed sacred music. She has composed several hymn settings for the Piano Prelude series published by Concordia Publishing House. She's a regular organist at Christ Lutheran Church in Lincoln, Nebraska. And for this year's start to Trinity Academy at Concordia University, she will be teaching music theory. Please welcome Dr. Grimpo.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today. 2 years ago, my students and I read a book called Beauty, What It Is and Why It Matters, by John Mark Mirabal, Professor of Systemic and Moral Theology at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Maryland. It was not an overly challenging book, academically speaking, but it was an important book, because in an age where the word beauty is overused and its meaning subjectified, it defined beauty from a biblical perspective in a very simple and objective way, offering a basic framework from which we can judge beauty in our own lives. This definition can be applied to anything, from major works of music and the fine arts to simple, everyday things that happen to be around us. The author suggested that beauty is a combination of order and surprise. Think of creation, the standard by which we should judge all beauty. God is a God of order. Creation is full of patterns and orderliness. God is also a God of grace. Creation is full of unexpected blessings and surprises that delight us. Because mankind is created in his image, we are hardwired to gravitate toward things that are orderly and logical, while at the same time delightful and surprising. This is why we prefer music that is composed in the same way, and why music that lacks order and delight is uninteresting and confusing at best, and off-putting at worst. That God would leave beauty on this sinful earth, beauty both that He created and beauty that He created us to make and enjoy, is a very gracious and rich thing indeed. In the following minutes, I will draw parallels from rhetoric in writing to rhetoric in music, discussing both the 5 major canons of rhetoric and several of the many figures of rhetoric, supporting the argument that good rhetoric in music is vital. Then I will apply these canons and figures to Bach's work for solo keyboard, the Italian Concerto. Rhetoric is beautiful. It has elements of order and logic, as well as elements of surprise, delight, originality. That's why it's effective. That's why we are drawn to it. That's why we strive to perfect it. Rhetoric, which in its simplest sense refers to good writing, is not just found in speeches, papers, and books. It's found in music as well. In any type of fine art that involves a performance, it is typical for the creator of the work and the performer of the work to be different people. If a work is not well constructed, it will be difficult for the performer to deliver it. Conversely, if a work is well constructed, it will be a pleasure for the performer to deliver it. By logic, a performer's job is to communicate what the composer has written. After all, music carries meaning, and the performer takes what's on the page and brings it to life. Sometimes the meaning in a piece of music is very clear. Some music is written for special occasions, in honor or in memory of someone, as tributes. Some music has lyrics. Some music is programmatic, when the composer had an image, poem, story, or idea in mind when composing the work. Without a doubt, music communicates. Yet sometimes the meaning isn't very clear. There is no tribute. It doesn't have lyrics. There is no programmatic focus. However, music still communicates a mood, an energy, an affect. Well-intentioned teachers may ask students, what is this piece trying to say? Though it might be fun for them to use their imaginations, maybe it's not trying to say anything. Not everything in life must convey a message. Not every work of music must communicate something specific or advance an agenda. Maybe the integrity of a composition speaks for itself, and the music is simply but profoundly the presence of beauty, given by God for us to enjoy. It matters not if the composer is a Christian, for all people are created in the image of God and are therefore capable of creating things that are orderly and delightful, things of beauty. Music that utilizes proper rhetoric in both the compositional process and the performance is something that shows the goodness of God in day-to-day life. Similarly, it matters not if the listener is Christian, for all people are capable of perceiving beauty and are instinctively drawn to it. Because of these truths, music just might be the thing that opens the door for thought and conversation, an area of common ground by which deeper theological discussions might flow. Summarized in the book, The Sound of Beauty by living classical composer Michael Kurek are the 5 canons of rhetoric: inventio, dispositio, elocutio, memoria, and pronunciatio. And here within these 5 canons is where we see how vital to a piece of music the contributions of both composer and performer are. Most music cannot exist without both. The roles of composer and performer, when observed through the canons of rhetoric, are both clear and organic. 1. Inventio refers to inventiveness or imagination, creativity. To some extent, this canon pertains to composer and performer because creativity is required of both. Creativity in the compositional process and creativity in the shades and nuances of the performance. However, the composer shoulders most of this responsibility in the sense that he or she brings the composition into being. The performer brings the work to life. An observation about creativity that is at once very obvious, but profound. Writers of the English language use a mere 26 letters, turning them into words, then into phrases and sentences, then into paragraphs, then into complete works, all while inserting meaningful punctuation and word choice and order, etc. along the way. That is amazing. Likewise, composers use a mere 12 pitches, turning them into chords, then into phrases, then into larger sections, then into complete works, all while inserting meaningful rhythms, dynamics, timbres, pitch ranges, etc. along the way. That is equally amazing. Periodically reflecting on this can renew appreciation and love for what we do, whether it's writing, performing, or teaching. It can affirm just how unique and creative all people are and instill in us a reminder that as we create and perform works of writing or works of music, to treat these gifts of God, letters and pitches, with care and respect as we use them throughout our daily lives. 2. Dispositio refers to how a work is organized. Just as the creation of a speech or a paper benefit from an initial outline, so does a work of music benefit from a formal structure. Rarely does a successful composer simply start composing without a general idea of the form. The result might be similar to a paper that is conceived without an outline. It could contain some good material, but the inorganization, perhaps lack of cohesiveness, could render the initial creativity relatively ineffective. Beware of music where this is the case. A clear use of form does not hamper creativity, quite the contrary. It allows it to flourish in a way that makes sense and is a delight to the listener. Binary and ternary forms are perhaps the most basic musical formal structures, yet throughout history, we encounter forms of every kind: theme and variation, ritornello, prelude and fugue, sonata allegro, minuet and trio, rondo, and many, many others. Even through composed forms have a structure of some kind, or a musical outline, if you will. Therefore, a performer, when delivering the music, benefits from understanding the formal design determined by the composer. A performer with a clear concept of the form by their artistry will aid the audience in understanding it as well. 3. Elocutio refers to how the style of the work is tailored to the intended audience. In a very broad way, this has to do with the major historical periods of music. Music sounded different in each because, as culture and tastes changed, music evolved accordingly. Music in the Baroque era tended to be sophisticated and elaborate. Melodies were highly decorated. Texture was largely polyphonic. Music in the Classical era tended to be elegant. Melodies were simple and memorable. Harmonies were homophonic, clear, and easy to follow. Music in the Romantic era tended to represent a variety of sounds and textures. Music was intended to elicit an emotional response from the listener, and extremes within the music were highlighted. Music in the 20th century tended to be experimental, sometimes, though not always, for the sake of trying to discover something novel rather than for the sake of the music itself. In an even more specific way, style can also pertain to musical genres. Genres are categories of music within the historical eras. Examples might be motet, madrigal, concerto, string quartet, symphony, art song, genres that are still composed today. The 20th century saw a significant broadening and diversification of musical styles as genres of musical theater, ragtime, jazz, blues, rock and roll, film music, and others emerged. All this information regarding musical styles of both the historical eras and genres within them inform both composers and performers as they choose what to compose and what to perform. Composers composed and still compose with careful thought to the conventions of the day within any given genre they might choose. Performers, both historically and now, choose music that appeals to the tastes and norms of the day in genres most suited to their intended audience. Today's performers have the luxury, sometimes overwhelmingly so, of having access to hundreds of years of music from which to choose. An effective way to choose music is to approach the task with a heart of charity for your listener, choosing music that is within the range of their taste and their listening potential. 4. Memoria is the ability to present a work from memory without the aid of a written score. This canon of rhetoric pertains almost entirely to the performer, since without the performer, a work of music exists on paper only. There are certainly debates around the necessity of memorization. I'm acutely aware of them in the area of piano. But regardless of your personal feelings, it is irrefutable that a deep and intimate knowledge of a work helps one deliver it better. Whether memorized or not, the delivery of music is a live art and unfolds over time. For it to be effective and largely predictable, it must be prepared solidly. 5. Pronunciatio refers to the manner of delivery. Just as a brilliantly written speech can fall flat upon a poor delivery, so a brilliantly written piece of music can fall flat upon an ineffective and uninformed performance. Here, the rhetorical triangle can be called to mind: logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos pertains to rational speech. The primary aim of this category is to communicate the music clearly. correct notes and rhythms being assumed, the performer can communicate clarity through appropriate and clean articulation and through intentional voicing and balance, bringing out what needs to be brought out. Pathos pertains to emotions. The primary aim of this category is to communicate the music convincingly. Performers do this through subtle use of timing and well-calculated use of shadings and dynamics. Ethos pertains to character. The primary aim of this category is to communicate the music credibly. Performers do this by understanding the history and genre of the piece they are performing, thereby giving an informed performance, one that affirms the performer's credibility. Within these 5 canons of rhetoric, which frame the large-scale approach to any well-designed and executed speech, writing, or musical work, are the numerous figures of rhetoric, which offer a rich variety of ways to make the details of the work memorable, interesting, and impactful. The following are 7 rhetorical figures that can easily be recognized and identified in music: repetition, juxtaposition, amplification, tricolon, anaphora, climax, and rhythm. Repetition occurs in all types of ways in writing and speech, but at its most basic, repetition is simply saying the same thing throughout a work. In music, repetition is when the same musical material comes back throughout the piece, offering a sense of unity to the composition. Juxtaposition involves placing opposites side by side for a point of comparison. This can be done in music by placing contrasting motives, sub-phrases, or phrases right next to each other. Amplification is repeating something in a more powerful way. As in writing and speaking, this can be done in a variety of ways in music: broadening the rhythm, thickening the texture by adding octaves or fuller chords, increasing the dynamic level. Tricolon is considered by many to be one of the most important and powerful of the numerous rhetorical figures. A tricolon consists of 3 units of material of approximately the same length and similar meaning, occurring in immediate succession. The easiest place to see tricolon in music is the sequence. A sequence in music is a short melodic pattern repeated in immediate succession at a different pitch level. Its intent is often to intensify the musical passage. Although a sequence can theoretically be repeated indefinitely, good composers know, perhaps instinctively, that 3 times works best. More than 3 can sound predictable or give the impression that the composer ran out of other ideas or got caught in a spiral. Less than 3 goes by so quickly that there's nothing particularly memorable or noteworthy about it. So most of the time, 3 it is, and after the 3rd statement in a sequence, the composer moves on, taking the musical material in a different direction. Anaphora is when short, repeating phrases start the same way, but end a little differently. Parallel to music is just that. A musical anaphora is similar to a sequence, in that there is repeating material, but in an anaphora, each repetition of a phrase starts at the same pitch level and ends with something a little different. Climax is a word that is familiar to most musicians because, like sentences, musical phrases often have a narrative arc. Identifying the climax of a phrase or a larger section of music can guide performers in knowing how to shape it. Finally, rhythm. Rhythm is perhaps the most obvious of these figures because it's fundamental to music. Rhythm is fundamental to speech too, but rhythm is easier to hear and quantify in music because it's made of note values with definitive lengths. Rhythm is the lifeblood, the energy of music. At this point, we turn to the music of J.S. Bach. His music undoubtedly holds the honor of being among the greatest music in history. Performers love it. Composers study it. Historians and theorists are fascinated by it, and fellow Lutherans hold it especially dear. There are volumes of writings dedicated to proving the musical genius of Bach, and they are completely valid and wonderfully insightful. However, at the very basic, Bach's music is orderly and structured, and the combination of pitches, rhythms, and harmonies are delightful. Order and delight. That's beauty. Regardless of taste and musical preference, Bach's music is objectively beautiful. Observations into the way Bach approached rhetoric, both the canons of rhetoric and the figures of rhetoric, can illuminate the standard by which to judge other music. To do so, Bach's Italian Concerto, a 3-movement work for solo keyboard, will be examined. Back to the 5 canons of rhetoric. The first, inventiveness. Perhaps you caught the oxymoron in the previous sentence. A concerto for solo keyboard, implying a concerto for one instrument only. If you thought that didn't sound quite right, you'd be correct. Traditionally, a Baroque concerto was a multi-movement work for orchestra and instrumental soloists, who would dialogue back and forth as the music unfolded. Instrumentation could vary, but a concerto always took a group of musicians to execute. Bach's Italian Concerto, a multi-movement work for keyboard alone, only takes one performer. Very inventive on the part of Bach. Since the harpsichord, the keyboard instrument of Bach's day, is a harmonic instrument and is also capable of various timbres through different manuals and combinations of strings, he decided to make the harpsichord both orchestra and soloist. A very inventive concept and approach. Bach specified that the work should be performed on a 2-manual harpsichord to simulate the differing dynamics and timbres of the orchestra and soloist. Throughout the past decades, pianists have been quite successful in performing this work on the modern grand, the instrument most likely to be at our disposal, and through careful articulation, phrasing, and dynamics can achieve a similar sense of instrumental dialogue. The second canon, organization. Bach chose to keep the standard 3-movement form of the concerto. The tempo scheme is fast, slow, fast. The first and third movements, both in the key of F major, are in ritornello form, which was very typical. Ritornello form, translated from the Italian as little return, is exactly that. A main theme will return throughout a movement as a unifying device. Sometimes the thematic material will return in the same or a similar way. Sometimes it will return in another key. Sometimes it will return in a varied form. Rarely is a ritornello form neat and clean, and that's part of the reason for its uniqueness and charm. However, the main passage, the ritornello, will be recognizable throughout, even if it appears slightly differently. The second movement is slow, and as was standard, in a related key, in this instance D minor, the relative minor. The second movement is considered to be an arioso, which is a nod to an aria, a piece that is sung by a soloist in an opera, oratorio, or cantata. This arioso features a free-flowing melody that unfolds almost as if it was being improvised by a vocalist. It is heartfelt and expressive, while the left hand keeps a steady pulse throughout. The third canon, style. A well-trained ear would recognize this piece, without knowing what it was, as being from the Baroque. How? Because Bach adhered to the style of the day, sounds that people were used to hearing. Several features of Baroque style are present in this work and can be heard in the texture, the rhythm, and the melody. The dominant texture of Baroque music was polyphonic, which is best described as multiple melody lines interweaving with each other. Sometimes the polyphonic texture in Baroque music could boast up to 6 different lines, none of them less important than another. Baroque rhythm was constantly moving, utilizing rhythmic patterns that were repeated over and over, propelling the music forward, giving it energy. That sense of energy, especially in fast movements, was continuous. Melodies in Baroque instrumental music were highly elaborate, though generally too ornate and complex to be tunes that one could recall and hum later. They were nonetheless orally attractive and pleasing. These descriptions sound complicated, and in Western music of the time, German Baroque style had the reputation of being the most complex. Italian music of the time was considered to be a little lighter, a little clearer, perhaps more tuneful. In other words, a little less complex. Italian is a word Bach used in the title, signifying that this work more closely imitated the Italian style of Baroque writing than the heavier German style. The fourth and fifth canons, memory and delivery, these lie completely within the realm of the performer. Bach himself was a highly skilled keyboardist and undoubtedly played his own works. And however fascinating it would be to know how he would have performed his own music, we simply don't know. But we can get extraordinarily close by acquiring insight into the way he approached the first three canons of rhetoric: inventiveness, form, and style. And by knowing the details of the piece, the figures of rhetoric, so well that the performance is one of integrity. And that, a performance with integrity, should be the goal of any music we study and perform. Now, we go back to the 7 selected figures of rhetoric and identify moments in the work where each can be heard. Repetition. This can be heard throughout the entire work, specifically the first and third movements. Many times you'll hear lots of moments of imitation. This is not a surprise, since the essence of rhetorical form relies substantially on repetition and should be noticeable when listening. Juxtaposition. Perhaps the most obvious place to hear this is the beginning of the second movement. The left hand starts alone. A 4-note ascending pattern is followed by a 4-note descending pattern. So putting those opposites side by side, interspersed between low tonic pedals and the very bottom register. Followed immediately by one that does the exact opposite. So an example of juxtaposition. Amplification. This can be heard at the very beginning of the first movement. The main theme is heard in the home key of F. It is immediately followed by the same theme, up a fifth, in the key of C. No bridge, no connected material, just the main theme in a much higher key, amplifying it. Tricolon. Like repetition, this can be heard throughout the entire work. It's all over. If you listen closely, you'll hear many short motivic sequences, often in groupings of 3. Often, sequences rise in pitch, but in this work of Bach, he also includes many sequences that fall in pitch, so you'll hear both. Here's one that ascends. So it goes by very quickly, but you can hear the 3 short units back to back, rising in pitch level. So that's an example of tricolon in the form of a sequence. Anaphora. This device is a little less common than a sequence, tricolon, but it can be heard a couple times in the first movement. Although an anaphora sounds like a sequence, many times in 3 segments, The beginning of each segment starts at the same pitch level and only ends with sequence material. So you can hear those 3 units again. They start the same, but the ending is slightly different. Climax. Because these are integral to any well-composed phrase, there are numerous phrase climaxes throughout. Rhythm. As stated earlier, the rhythmic energy is continuous, especially in the outer movements. Lest the rhythmic patterns become motor-like and monotonous, they, which go hand in hand with the melody and harmony, need shape and direction. Ryan N.S. Topping, currently professor of theology at Newman Theological College in Edmonton, Canada, and respected author, has written a succinct and useful book with advice on writing and speaking clearly and persuasively. Many of his ideas can be applied to music performances quite nicely and are things that good performers often do naturally. From a musician's perspective, his advice can be summarized into 3 succinct guidelines. 1, prioritize clarity. Hold accuracy and style to the highest standard. 2, let prudence be your guide. Too much or too little emotion detracts and distracts from the music. 3, perform with confidence yet humility. A performer owes it to the composer and the audience to do so. It can be an enjoyable activity to analyze music by studying the canons of rhetoric, to understand the composer's approach and design more fully, and by finding the rhetorical figures in the music that can inform and shape the musicality of the delivery. Discovering good communication in the way music is constructed is very rewarding and can invigorate performers to play a more active and convincing role in the performance. Most importantly, good rhetoric in music allows performers the opportunity to communicate the order and delight inherent in the music, to bless the listener, that they may hear and experience beauty, a gift of God that He has given us in this life. And if you want to stay,
Simplest question ever. I didn't catch the Latin spelling of the word for delivery.
Pronunciatio.
Oh, pronunciatio. Okay, I haven't heard it.
Yes.
I love the presentation. I wrote a paper on that in grad school, just the idea of rhetoric with music. And I also like the connection how our education impacts then the divine service, and how that use of rhetoric is actually really important in the divine service as well, and how music is used. I don't know if you want to speak more to that, but the music in our church, how that can be used in connection with what we're learning in school and classical music.
I'm not going to speak on that, only except that the liturgy and the hymnody is very dear, and it's a treasure. To be able to use it and to pass it on. I mean, they contain the truths of Scripture in a very beautiful way paired with music. So that's all I'm going to say. But hymnody and liturgy is very, very dear to me. Any of you want to comment on that? Okay. Yeah.
I have a question about, are you familiar with the Suzuki method, and how does that fit in with the rhetoric that you're talking about?
I am not familiar with the Suzuki method. The only thing I know is that they're taught by ear, correct me if I'm wrong, without actually reading notation until a certain point. Okay, how does that fit with rhetoric? I think humans were attracted to things that are orderly and that make sense. I've got a daughter who lives in what I would consider messy quarters, and she doesn't thrive very well in that until it's cleaned up and a little bit more organized. I think all humans are like that. And I think the same is true for music, and I've given this a lot of thought. There's experimental music is out there, and on the one hand, it doesn't have the order, logic, and beauty to it that I think humans are attracted to. And so, I don't know, I thought about that a lot with modern music like Suzuki. They use well-constructed music, and I think you can even talk about the rhetoric in that, even without the aid of notation.
I was thinking about how you, at the beginning, you're saying that even non-Christians can appreciate the beauty of music, and I think if you hear the story of Suzuki, he understood that very well, and the teacher of Suzuki as well. I've just seen that in our own children as they grow up in Suzuki. How can we get that to our children earlier? Like, Suzuki is able to deliver that memorization, that all of those things that we're talking about in the classical method to children as young as 3, 4, 5 years old. How do we start using that in the Lutheran world is how I kind of...
You mean at the very basic levels?
Yeah.
I think it's important to understand that as musicians, we are only part of the music. Somebody wrote it. We didn't write it. And so to teach the kids from the youngest age, they're learning music, they're learning folk songs, whatever it is, but to treat that music with such a sense of integrity, because it's somebody else's creation, and I try to think about that when I perform music, that I don't know any composers in the room. I think it would be hard to be a composer, because you're creating music and then you're putting it out there, and you're trusting that the people who get their hand on it will deliver it in a way that has integrity. And so I think even at a young level, you can instill that in the children, that they are part of a process, a part of a collaboration between composer and performer. I mean, they go hand in hand, and each is important.
You spoke about throughout the 5 canons of rhetoric applying to composer and performer. As you instruct students in music, what about the connection to the listener, the audience member? Can a better understanding of the 5 canons as applied to music and the rhetoric of music, help with music appreciation and that sort of thing?
I think so. I think that the better you understand the piece as a performer, the more clearly you are going to offer it to the audience. And if you do things with nuancing, timing, and voicing, you can really kind of make those rhetorical figures kind of pop. And I think anybody would appreciate that. It's order and structure, it's beauty. And so, don't just play. Yeah, practicing with a metronome is good, but it's not for too long, because you don't want to deliver it that way. You want to deliver it with heart. Keeping in mind the style of the day. There were certain conventions for different historical periods. Yeah, I answered your question. Another thing that escaped me. Oh, also, I think to think about your audience and what their listening potential might be. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but sometimes we love a piece and we just want to play it because we want the audience to love it too. It may not be, the right match, well, you got to know your audience, I think. But interestingly, historically, in the 20th century, was really the first time in music history that composers did not feature only new compositions in recitals or performances, because the newer music was experimental. It wasn't quite as tuneful. There were some weird things going on, and they knew it was too much for the audience to handle an hour of that. And so that's when you see more pulling back of Mozart, things like that. So there would be a good balance. So I think that's a lesson for us, that there's a lot of great stuff out there, but there's not enough time to do everything, so pick things. I think that would be the best for you.
The first book you referenced at the very beginning of the talk, Beauty by?
Mirabal, Miravlle. It was a good book. It was a good book, yeah.
I just want to thank you for the work you've done in the David's Harp books. When I come home and hear my kids playing a simple version of a hymn, it's amazing. So thank you.
I teach college students all day, so that's a very fun project for me, but I don't ever really get to hear them, so hearing stories about that, thank you. Good? Thank you.